Well, there you are. We wondered if you was going to make it tonight. Me and a few of the regulars were just sitting around here chatting and telling stories, as we always do, sipping on our drinks. But we're glad you're here now. Now, you haven't heard these stories these old-timers are telling. And I got one or two I want to tell you tonight. You know, we're working on that story by Max Brand, TRAILIN the Night Horseman. And it was getting pretty wild. They tried to burn him out and kill his animals. And so far, it looks like he's surviving. The barn looks like it went down, but the horse and the dog are alive, so wow. So if you get you something to drink, get settled in, say your hellos, and we'll just start in on this. You know, we've made it all the way to chapter 24. Dr. Byron looks into the past. That's where we'll start. The black head of Barry, the brown head of Randall Byron, the golden head of Kate Cumberland were all bowed around the limp body of Black Bart. Buck Daniels, still gasping for breath, stood reeling nearby. "Let me attempt to resuscitate the animal," offered the doctor. He was met by a blank look from Barry. The hair of the man was scorched. His skin was blistered and burnt. Only his hands remained uninjured, and these continued to move over the body of the great dog. Kate Cumberland was on her knees over the brute. "Is it fatal, Dan?" she asked. "Is there hope for Bart?" There was no answer from Barry, and she attempted to raise the fallen, lifeless head of the animal, but instantly a strong arm darted out and brushed her hands away. Those hands fell idly at her sides, and her head went back, as though she had been struck across the face. She found herself looking up into the angry eyes of Randall Byron. He reached down and raised her to her feet. There was no color in her face, no life in her limbs. "There's nothing more to be done here, apparently," said the doctor coldly. "Suppose we take your father and go back to the house." She made neither assent nor dissent. Dan Barry had finished a swift, deft bandage and stopped the bleeding of the dog's wounds. Now he raised his head, and his glance slipped rapidly over the faces of the doctor and the girl and rested on Buck Daniels. There was no flash of kindly thanks, no word of recognition. His right hand raised to his cheek and rested there, and in his eyes came that flare of yellow hate. Buck Daniels shrunk back until he was lost in the crowd. Then he turned and stumbled back towards the house. Instantly, Barry began to work at expanding and depressing the lungs of the huge animal, as he might have worked to bring a man back to life. "Watch him," whispered the doctor to Kate Cumberland. "He's closer to that dog, that wolf, it looks like, than he's ever been to any human being." She would not answer, but she turned her head quickly away from the man and his beast. "Are you afraid to watch?" challenged Byron, for his anger at Barry's blunt refusals still made his blood hot. "When your father lay at death's door, was he half so anxious as he is now? Did he work so hard by half? See how his eyes are fixed on the muzzle of the beast as if he is studying a human face." "No, no," breathed the girl. "I tell you, look," commanded the doctor, "for there's the solution to the mystery. No mystery at all. Barry is simply a man who is closer akin to the brute forces in nature. See? By the eternal heavens, he's dragging that dumb beast, back from the door of death." Barry had ceased his rapid manipulations and turned the big dog back upon its side. Now the eyes of Black Bart opened and winked shut again. Now the master kneeled at the head of the beast and took the scarred, scraggy head between his hands. "Bart," he commanded. Not a stir in the long black body. The stallion edged a pace closer, dropped his velvet muzzle, and whinnied softly at the very ear of the dog. Still, not a stir in that long black body. Now the stallion edged a pace closer, dropped his velvet muzzle, and whinnied softly at the very ear of that dog. Still, there was not an answering quiver. "Bart," called the man again, and there was a ring of wild grief, of fear in his cry. "Do you hear?" said Byron savagely at the ear of the girl. "Did you ever use such a tone with a human being? Ever?" "Take me away," she murmured. "I'm sick. I'm sick at heart. Take me away." Indeed, she was scarcely sure of her poise, and tottered where she stood. Dr. Byron slipped his arm about her and led her away, supporting half of her weight. They went slowly, by small, soft steps, towards the house. Before they reached it, he knew that she was weeping. But if there was sadness in Byron, there was also a great joy. He was afire. For there is a flame-like quality in hope. Loss of blood and the stifling smoke, rather than a mortal injury or the touch of fire, had brought Black Bart close to death. But now that his breathing was restored, almost normal, he gained rapidly. One instant he lingered on the border between life and death, and the next, the brute's eyes opened and glittered with dim recognition up towards Dan, and he licked the hand which supported his head. At Dan's direction, a blanket was brought, and after Dan had lifted Black Bart upon it, 4 men raised the corners of the blanket and carried the burden towards the house. One of the cowpunchers went ahead bearing the light. This was the sight that Dr. Byron and Kate Cumberland saw from the veranda of the ranch house as they turned and looked back before going in. "A funeral procession," suggested the doctor. "No," she answered positively. "If Black Bart were dead, Dan wouldn't allow any hands save his own to touch the body. No, Black Bart is alive, yet it's impossible." The word impossible, however, was gradually dropping from the vocabulary of Randall Byron. True, the wolf dog had seemed dead past recovery, and across the eyes of Byron came a vision of the dead rising from their graves. Yet he merely shook his head and said nothing. "Ah," she broke in, "look!" The procession drew nearer, heading towards the back of the big house. And now they saw that Dan Barry walked beside the body of Black Bart, a smile on his lifted face. They disappeared behind the back of the house. Byron heard the girl murmuring, more to herself than to him, "Once he was like that all the time." "Like what?" he asked bluntly. She paused, and then her hand dropped lightly on his arm. He could not see more than a vague outline of her in the night, only the dull glimmer of her face as she turned her head and the faint whiteness of her hand. "Let's say good night," she answered at length. "Our little worlds have toppled about our heads tonight. All your theories, it seems, and God knows all that I have hoped. Why should we stay here and make ourselves miserable by talk?" "But because we have failed," he said steadily, "is that a reason we should creep off and brood over our failure in silence?" "You have a fine courage," said the girl, "but what is there we can say?" He answered, "For my part, I am not so miserable as you think. For I feel as if this night had driven us closer together, you see, and I've caught a perspective on something that has happened here. Tell me what you know. Only what I think I know. It may be painful to hear." "Well, I'm very used to pain," she says. "Well, a moment ago, when Barry was walking beside his dog smiling, you murmured that he once was like that always. It gave me light. So I'd say that there was a time when Dan Barry lived here with you and your father. Am I right?" "Yes, for years and years." "And in those times he was not greatly different from other men, not on the surface." "No." "And you became very fond of him." "We were to marry," answered Kate Cumberland, and Byron winced. He went on. "Then something happened, suddenly, that took him away from you, and you did not see him again until tonight. Am I right?" "Yes, I thought you must have heard the story from the outside. And I'll tell you the truth. My father found Dan Barry wandering across the hills years ago. He was riding home over the range, and he heard a strange and beautiful whistling, and when he looked up he saw on the western ridge, walking against the sky, a tattered figure of a boy. He rode up and asked the boy his name. He learned it was Dan Barry. Whistlin Dan, he was called. But the boy could not, or would not, tell how he came to be there in the middle of the range without a horse. He merely said that he came from over there, and he waved his hand to the south and the east, and that was all. He didn't seem to be alarmed because he was alone, and yet he apparently knew nothing of the country. He was lost in this terrible country where a man could wander for days without finding a house, and yet the boy was whistling as he walked. So Dad took him home and sent out letters all about, to the railroad in particular, to find out if such a boy was missing. Now he received no answer, and in the meantime he gave Dan a room in the house, and I remember how Dan sat at the table that first night. I was a very little girl then, and how I laughed at his strange way of eating. His knife was the only thing he was interested in, and he made it serve for a knife, a fork, and a spoon all together. And he held the meat in his fingers while he cut it. The next morning, he was missing. One of Dad's range riders picked up Dan several miles to the north, walking along, whistling gaily. The next morning he was missing again, and he was caught still farther away. After that, Dad had a terrible scene with him. I don't know exactly what happened, but Dan promised to run away no more, and ever since then Dad has been closer to Dan than anyone else. So Dan grew up. From the time I could first distinctly remember, he was very gentle and good-natured, but he was different, always. After a while, he got Black Bart, and then he went out with a halter and captured Satan. Think of capturing a wild Mustang with nothing but a halter. He played around with him so much that I was jealous of him. So I kept with him until Bart and Satan were rather used to me. Bart would even play with me now and then when Dan wasn't around. And so finally Dan and I were to be married. When Dad didn't like the idea. He was afraid of what Dan might become. And he was right. One day, in a saloon that used to stand on that hill over there, Dan had a fight, his first fight, with a man who had struck him across the mouth for no good reason. That man was Jim Silent. Of course you've heard of him. Well, never. Well, he was a famous long rider, an outlaw with a very black record. And at the end of that fight, he struck Dan down with a chair and he escaped. I went down to Dan when I heard of the fight. Black Bart led me down, to be exact. But Dan would not come back to the house, and he'd have no more to do with anyone until he had found Jim Silent. I can't tell you everything that happened. Finally, he caught Jim Silent and he killed him with his bare hands. Buck Daniels saw it. Then Dan came back to us, but on the first night he began to grow restless. It was just last fall. The wild geese were flying south. And while they were honking in the sky, Dan got up, said goodbye, and he left us. And we have never seen him again until tonight. All we knew is that he had ridden south after the wild geese. A long silence fell between them, and the doctor was thinking hard. And when he came back, he said, Barry did not know you? I mean, you were nothing to him? You were there, said the girl faintly. It is perfectly clear, said Byron. If it were a little more commonplace, it might be puzzling, but being so extraordinary, it clears itself up. Did you really expect the dog, the wolf dog, Black Bart, to remember you? Well, I may have expected it, but you were not surprised, of course. Well, naturally not. Yet you see that Dan Barry, Whistlin Dan you call him, was closer to Black Bart than he was to you? And why should I see that? Well, you watched him a moment ago when he was leaning over the dog. He watched her draw her dressing gown closer to her as though the cold bit a bit more keenly then. She said simply, Yes, I saw. Well, don't you see that he is simply more in tune with the animal world? And it's really no more reasonable to expect Black Bart to remember you than to expect Dan Barry to remember you. It's quite plain. When you go back to the beginning, man was simply an animal, without the higher senses, as we call them. It was simply a brute, living in trees or in caves. Afterwards, he grew into all the things we know. But why not imagine a throwback into the earlier instincts? Why not imagine the creature devoid of the impulse of mind, the thing which we call man, and see the splendid animal. You saw in Dan Barry simply a biological sport, the freak, the thing which retraces the biological process and comes very close to the primitive. But of course, you could not realize this. He seemed a man, and you accepted him as a man. In reality, he was no more a man than Black Bart is a man. He had the face and the form of a man, but his instincts are as old as he ages. The animal world obeys him. Satan neighs in answer to his whistle. The wolf dog licks his hand at the point of death. There is no profound difference, always. You try to reconcile him with other men. You give him the attributes of other men. Open your eyes. See the truth, that he is no more akin to man than Black Bart is like a man. And when you give him your affection, Miss Cumberland, you are giving your affection to a wild wolf. Do you believe me? Well, he knew that she was shaken. He could feel it, even without the testimony of his eyes to witness. So he went on, speaking with great rapidity, lest she should escape from the influence which he had already gained over her. I felt it when I first saw him, a certain nameless kinship with elemental forces. The wind blew through the open door. It was Dan Barry. The wild geese called from the open sky for Dan Barry. These are the things which lead him. These the forces which direct him. You have loved him, but is love merely a giving? No, no. You have seen in him the man, but I see in him merely the animal force. She said after a moment, Do you hate him? You plead against him so passionately. And he answered her, Can you hate a thing which is not human? No. But can you dread it? It escapes from the laws which bind you and which bind me. What standards govern it? How can you hope to win it? Love? What beauty is there in the world to appeal to such a creature, except the beauty of the marrow bone which his teeth have the strength to snap? Ah, listen, murmured the girl. Here is your answer. And Dr. Randall Byron heard a sound like the muted music of the violin, thin and small and wonderfully penetrating. He could not tell at first what it might be, for it was as unlike the violin as it was like the bow and the rosin string. Then he made out, surely, that it was the whistling of a human being. It followed no tune, no reason theme. The music was beautiful in its own self. It rose straight up like the skylark from the ground, sheer up against the white light of the sky. And there it sang against heaven's gate. He had never heard harmony like it. He would never again hear such music, so thin and yet so full that it went through him, until he felt the strains take a new, imitative life within him. He would have whistled the strains himself, but he could not follow them. They escaped him. They soared above him. They followed no law and no rhythm. They flew on wings and left him far below. The girl moved away from him, as if led by an invisible hand, and now she stood at the extremity of the porch, and he followed her. Do you hear? She cried, turning to him. What is it? Asked the doctor. It is he. Don't you understand? Barry, yes, but what does the whistling mean? Is it for his wolf dog? I don't know, she answered quickly. All I understand is that it is beautiful. Where are your theories and explanations now, Dr. Byron? It is beautiful, God knows. But doesn't the wolf dog understand it better than either you or I? She turned and she faced Byron, standing very close. And when she spoke, there was something in her voice which was like a light. In spite of the dark, he could guess at every varying shade of her expression. To the rest of us, she murmured, Dan has nothing but silence, hardly a glance. Buck saved his life tonight, and yet Dan remembered nothing except the blow which had been struck. And now he pours out all the music in his soul for a dumb beast. Listen. He saw her straighten herself and stand taller. Then, through the wolf, I'll conquer the dumb beast. She whipped past Byron and disappeared into the house. At the very same instant, the whistling, in the midst of a faint high climax, broke, shivered, and was ended. There was only the darkness and the silence around Byron and the unsteady wind against his face. Chapter 25, The Werewolf. Dr. Byron, pacing the front veranda with his thoughtful head bowed, saw Buck Daniels step out with his quirt dangling in his hand, his cartridge belt buckled about his waist, and a great red silk bandana knotted at his throat. God, he was older by 10 years than he had been a few days before when the doctor first saw him. To be sure, his appearance was not improved by a 3 days' growth of beard. It gave his naturally dark skin a dirty cast, but even that rough stubble could not completely shroud the new hollows in Daniel's cheek. His long, black, uncombed hair sagged down raggedly across his forehead, hanging almost to his eyes. The eyes themselves were sunk in such formidable cavities that Byron caught hardly more than 2 points of light in the shadows. All the devil-may-care insouciance of Buck Daniels was quite gone. In its place was a dogged sullenness, a hang-dog air which one would not care to face of a dark night or in a lonely place. His manner was that of a man whose back is against the wall, who, having fled some keen pursuit, has now come to the end of his tether and prepares for desperate, even if hopeless, battle. There was that about him which made the doctor hesitate to address the cowpuncher. And at length he said, "You're going out for an outing, Mr. Daniels?" Buck Daniels started violently at the sound of his voice behind him, and whirled upon the doctor with such a set and contorted expression of fierceness that Byron jumped back. "Good God, man," cried the doctor, "what's up with you?" "Nothing," answered Buck, gradually relaxing from the first show of suspicion. "I'm beating it, that's all." "You're leaving us?" "Yes." "Not really." "Do you think I ought to stay?" asked Buck, with something of a sneer on his face. The doctor hesitated and frowned in a puzzled way. At length he threw out his hands in a gesture of mute abandonment. "My dear fellow," he said with a faint smile, "I've about stopped trying to think." At this, Buck Daniels grinned mirthlessly. "Now you're talking sense," he nodded. "There ain't no use in a-thinking." "But why do you leave so suddenly?" Buck Daniels shrugged his broad shoulders. "I am sure," went on Byron, "that Miss Cumberland will miss you." "She will not," answered the big cowpuncher. "She's got her hands full with him." "Exactly. But if it is more than she can do, if she makes no headway with that singular fellow, she may need help." He was interrupted by a slow, long-drawn, deep-throated curse from Buck Daniels. "Why in hell should I help her with him?" "Well, there is really no reason," answered the doctor, alarmed, "except, I suppose, old friendship." "Damn old friendship," burst out Buck Daniels. "There's an end to all things, and my friendship is worn out. On both sides. It's done." He turned and he scowled at the house. "Help her to win him over? I'd rather stick the muzzle of my gun down my throat and pull the trigger. I'd rather see her marry a man about to hang. Well, to hell with this place. I'm through with it. S'long, Doc." But Dr. Byron ran after him and halted at the foot of the steps down from the veranda. "My dear Mr. Daniels," he urged, touching the arm of Buck, "you really mustn't leave so suddenly as this. There are 1,000 questions on the tip of my tongue." Buck Daniels regarded the professional man with a hint of weariness and disgust. "Well," he said, "I'll hear the first couple of 100. Shoot." "First, the motive that sends you away." "Dan Barry." Fear of what he may do?" "Damn the fear. At least it's him that makes me go." It seems an impenetrable mystery, sighed the doctor. I saw you the other night step into the smoking hell of that barn and keep the way clear for this man. I knew, before that, how you rode and risked your life to bring Dan Barry back here. Surely those are proofs of friendship. Buck Daniels laughed unpleasantly. He laid a large hand on the shoulder of the doctor, and he answered him. If them was the only proofs, Doc, I wouldn't feel the way I do. Proofs of friendship? Dan Barry has saved me from the rope, and he saved me from dying by the gun of Jim Silent. He took me out of a rotten life and made me a man that could look honest men in the face. He paused now, swallowing hard, and the doctor's misty, overworked eyes lighted with some comprehension. He had felt from the first a certain danger in this big feller, a certain reckless disregard of laws and rules which commonly limit the actions of ordinary men. Now part of the truth was hinted at. Buck Daniels, on a time, had been outside of the law, and Barry had drawn him back to the ways of men, and that explained some of the singular bond that lay between them. Well, that ain't well, went on Buck. Blood is thick, and I've loved him better nor a brother. I've gone to hell and back for him. For him I took Kate Cumberland out of the hands of Jim Silent, and I left myself in her place. I took her away so all she could do is go to him. Damn him. And now, on account of him, I got to leave this place. His voice rose to a ringing pitch. Do you think it's easy for me to go? Do you think it ain't like tearing a fingernail off in the flesh for me to go away from Kate? God knows what she means to me. God knows. But if he does, he's forgotten me. Anguish of spirit set Buck Daniels shaking, and the doctor looked on in amazement. He was like one who reaches in his pocket for a copper coin and brings out a handful of gold pieces. Kind feelings don't come easy to me, went on Buck Daniels. I've been raised to fight. I've been raised to hard riding and dust in the throat. I've been raised on whiskey and hate. And then I met Dan Barry, and his voice was softer than a girl's voice, and his eyes didn't hold no doubt of me. Me that had sneaked in on him at night and was trying to kill him in his sleep because my chief had told me to. That was the Dan Barry that I first knew. He gave me his hand and gave me the trust of his eyes. And after he left me, I sat down and took my head between my hands, and my heart was like to bust inside me. It was like the clouds had blowed away from the sun and let it shine on me for the first time in my life. And I swore that if the time come, I'd repay him. For every cent he'd give me, I'd pay him back in gold. I'd follow to the end of the world to do what he bid me to do. His voice dropped suddenly, choked with emotion. Oh, Doc, they was tears come in my eyes, and I felt sort of clean inside. And I wasn't ashamed of them tears. That was what Dan Barry done for me. And I did pay him back, as much as I could. I met Kate Cumberland, and she was to me among girls what Dan Barry was to me among men. I ain't ashamed of saying it. I loved her till they was a dryness like ashes inside me. But I wouldn't even lift up my eyes to her because she belonged to him. I followed her around like a dog. I done her bidding. I asked no questions. And what she wanted, that was law to me, and all the law I wanted. All that I done for the sake of Dan Barry. And then I took my life in my hands for him. Not once, but day after day. Then he rode off and left her, and I stayed behind. Do you think it's been easy to stay here? Man, I've had to hear her talking about Dan Barry day after day, and never a word for me. And I had to tell her stories about Dan and what he'd used to do, and she'd sit with her eyes miles away from me, just listening and smiling, and me there hungering for just one look out of her eyes, hungering like a dying dog for water. And then for her and Joe, I rode down south, and when I met Dan Barry, do you think there was any light in his eyes when he seen me? No, he'd forgot me the way even a hoss won't forget his master. Forgot me after a few months, and after all that had gone between us. Not even Kate. Even she was nothing to him. But still, I kept at it, and I brought him back. I had to hurt him to do it, but God knows it wasn't out of the spite that I hit him. God knows. And when I see Dan go into that burning barn, I says to myself, Buck, if nothing is done, that wall will fall, and there's the end of Dan Barry. And there's the end of him. And that ain't any human use. And when he's finished, after a while, maybe Kate will get to know that there's other men in the world besides Dan. I says that to myself, deep and still inside me. And then I looked at Kate standing in that white thing with her yeller hair all blowing about her face, and I wanted her like a dying man wants heaven. But then I says to myself again, no matter what happened, he's been my friend. He's been my pal. He's been my bunkie. And Doc, you ain't got no way of knowing what a partner is out here. Maybe you sit in the desert about 1,000 miles from nowhere, and across that little mesquite fire, there's your pal, the only human thing in sight. Maybe you go months seeing only him. If you're sick, he takes care of you. If you're blue, he cheers you up. And that's what Dan Barry was to me. So I stand saying these things to myself, and I says, if I keep that wall from falling, Dan'll know about it. And there won't be no more proof of that yeller light in his eyes when he looks at me. And that's what I says to myself, poor fool. And I went into that fire, and I fought to keep that wall from falling. You know what happened. And when I come out staggering and blind and 3 parts dead, Dan Barry looks up to me and touches his face where I'd hit him, and the yeller comes up glimmering and blazing in his eyes. Then I went back to my room and I fought it out. And here's where I stand now. If I stay here, if I see that yeller light once more, they won't be no waiting. Him and me'll have to have it out right then. Am I a dog? Maybe. That I got to stand around and jump when he calls me? My dear fellow, my dear Mr. Daniels, cried the horrified Dr. Byron, surely you're wrong. He wouldn't go so far as to make a personal attack upon you, wouldn't he? Ah, not if he was a man, no, I tell you. He ain't a man. He's what a Canucks up north call a werewolf. There ain't no mercy or kindness in him. The blood of a man means nothing to him. The world might be better rid of him. Oh, he can be soft and gentle as a girl, mostly he is. But cross him just once, and he forgets all you done for him. Give him a taste of blood, and he jumps at your throat. I tell you, I've seen him do it. He broke off with a shudder. Doc, he said in a lower and solemn voice, maybe I've said too much. Don't tell Kate nothing about why I'm going. Let her go on dreaming her full dream. But now hear what I'm saying. If Dan Barry crosses me once more, one of us two dies, and die damn quick. It may be me, it may be him, but I've come to the end of my rope. I'm leaving this place till Barry gets a chance to come to his senses and see what I've done for him. That's all. I'm leaving this place because there's a blight on it, and that blight is Dan Barry. I'm leaving this place because, Doc, because I can smell the coming of bloodshed in it. There's death hanging over it. If the lightning was to hit and burn it up, house and man, the range would be better for it. And he turned on his heel, and he strode slowly down towards the corral. Dr. Byron followed his progress with starting eyes. Chapter 26, The Battle. The chain which fastened Black Bart had been passed around the trunk of a tree that stood behind the ranch house, and there the great dog lay tethered. Dr. Byron had told Whistlin Dan with some degree of horror that the open air was in the highest degree dangerous to wounds, but Whistlin Dan had returned no answer. So Black Bart lay all day in the soft sand, easing himself from time to time into a new position, and his thoughtful eyes seemed to be concentrated on the desire to grow well. And beside him was the chair in which Dan Barry sat for many an hour of the day and even the night. Kate Cumberland watched the animal from the shadow of the house. His eyes were closed, and the long, powerful head lay inert on the sand. Yet she knew that the wolf dog was perfectly aware of her presence. Day after day since he lay there, she had attempted to approach Black Bart, and day after day he had allowed her to come within reaching distance of him, only to drive her back at the last moment by a sudden display of the murderous long fangs, or by one of those snarls which comes out of the black depths of his heart. Now a dog snarls from not far down in his throat, but the noise of an angered wild beast rolls up from its very entrails, a passion of hate and defiance. And when she heard that sound, or when she saw the still more terrible silent rage of the beast, Kate Cumberland's spirit failed, and she would shrink back again to a safe distance. She was not easily discouraged. She had that grim resolution which comes to the gambler after he has played at that same table night after night, night after night, and lost, until playing with the last of his money, he begins to mutter through his set teeth, "The luck must change." So it was with Kate Cumberland, for in Black Bart she saw the only possible clue to Whistlin Dan. There was the stallion, to be sure, but she knew Satan too well. Nothing in this wide world could induce that wild heart to accept more than one master, more than one friend. For Satan there was in the animal world Black Bart, and in the world of men Dan Barry. These were enough. For all the rest he kept his disdainful speed of his slender legs or the terror of his teeth and trampling hooves. Even if she could have induced the stallion to eat from her hand, she could never have made him willing to trust himself to her guidance. Some such thing she felt that she must accomplish with Black Bart. To the wild beast with the scarred and shaggy head she must become a necessary, an accepted thing. One repulse did not dishearten her. Again and again she made the trial. She remembered having read that no animal can resist the thoughtful patience of a thinking man. And hour after hour she was there, until a new light in the eye of the wolf dog warned her that the true master was coming. Then she fled, and from a post of vantage in the house she would watch the two. An intimacy surpassing the friendship and devotion of human beings existed between them. She had seen the wolf lie with his great head on the foot of his master, and the unchanging eyes fixed on Barry's face. And so for an hour at a stretch, in mute worship, or she had watched the master go to the great beast to change the dressing, a thing which could not be done too often during the day. She had seen the swift hands remove the bandages, and she had seen the cleaning solution applied. She knew what it was. It stung even the unscratched skin, and to a wound it must be torture, but the wolf lay and endured, not even shuddering at the pain. It had seemed to her that this was the great test. If she could make that wolf lie like this for her, then truly she might feel herself in some measure admitted to that mystic fellowship of the three, the man, the stallion, the wolf. If she could, with her unaided hands, remove the bandages and apply that solution, then she could know many things, and she could feel that she was nearer to Whistlin Dan than ever before. So she had come, time and again, with that basin and the roll of cloth in her arm, and she had approached with infinite patience, step by step, and then inch by inch. And once it had taken a whole hour for her to come within a yard of the beast, and all that time Black Bart had lain with closed eyes. But at that critical instant, always there was the silent writhing up of the lips and the gleam of hate, or the terrible snarl while the eyes fastened on her throat. Her heart had stopped in mid-beat, and that day she ran back into the house and threw herself on her bed, and would not come from her room until the following morning. Now, as she watched from the shadow of the house, with the basin of antiseptic under her arm, the gambler's desperation grew stronger and stronger. She came out, at length, and walked steadily towards old Black Bart. She had grown almost heedless of fear at this moment, and when she was within a pace, once more the head reared back and the teeth flashed, and the heart of Kate Cumberland, as always, stopped. Yet she did not retreat this time. All the color left her face, so that her eyes seemed amazingly blue and wide. One foot drew back, tremblingly ready to spring to safety. Yet she held her place. She moved, and it was towards Black Bart. At that came a snarl that would have made the heart of a lone grizzly quake and leave his newfound guts. One further pace she made, and the beast plunged up and braced itself with one strong foreleg. A devil of yellow green gleamed in either eye, and past the grinning fangs she saw the hot, red throat. And she saw the flattened ears, and the scars on the bony forehead, and the muscles that bulged at the base of the jaw. Aye, strength to drive those knife-like teeth through flesh and bone at a single snap. More, she had seen their effect, and the throat of a bull cut at a single slash. And yet, she sank on her knees beside the monster. His head was well nigh as high as hers then. If he attacked, there could be no dream of escape for her. Or she might drag herself away from the tearing teeth, a disfigured horror forever. Think not that an iota of all those terrors missed her mind. No, she felt the fangs buried in her throat and heard the snarl of the beast stifled with blood. Yet she laid her hand on the bandage across the shoulder of Black Bart. His head whirled. With those ears flattened in that long, lean neck, it was like the head of a striking snake. Her sleeve was rolled up to the elbow, and over the bare skin the teeth of the wolf dog were set. The snarl had grown so deep and hideous that the tremor of it fairly shook her, and she saw that the jaws of the beast slavered with hunger. She knew 1,000 things about Bart, and among the rest, that he had tasted human blood. And there is a legend which says that once a wild beast has tasted the blood of man, he will taste it a second time before he dies. She thought of that. She dared not turn her head lest she should encounter the hellfire of Bart's eyes. Yet she had passed all ordinary fear. She had reached that exquisite frenzy of terror when it becomes one with courage. The very arm over which the wolf's teeth were set moved, raised, and with both hands she untied the knot of the bandage. The snarling rose to a pitch of maniacal rage. The teeth compressed. If they broke the skin, it was the end. The first taste of blood would be enough. And drew away her arm. If she had started then, all the devil in that creature would be loosed. For her terror taught her that. And by some mysterious power that entered her at that moment, she was able to turn her head slowly and look deep into those terrible eyes. Her arm was released. But Black Bart crouched, and the snake-like head lowered. He was quivering throughout, that steel-muscled body to throw himself at her throat. The finger was on the hair trigger. It needed pressure not greater than a bodiless thought, and still she looked into the eyes of the wolf dog. And her terror had made her strangely light of body and dizzy of mind. Then the change came suddenly. The yellow-green changed, swirled in the eyes of Black Bart. The eyes themselves wavered, and at last looked away. The snarl dropped to a sullen growl, and Black Bart lay down as he had been before. His head was still turned toward her, to be sure, and the teeth were still bared, as with rapid, deft fingers she undid the bandage, and from instant to instant, as the bandages, in spite of her care, pressed against the wound, the beast shivered, and wicked glances flashed up at her face. The safe blower who finds his soup cooling and dares not set it down felt as Kate Cumberland felt right then. She never knew what kept her hands steady, but steady they were. The cloth was removed, and now she could see the red, angry wound, and the hair shaven away to a little distance on every side. She dipped her cloth into the antiseptic. It stung her fingers. She touched the cloth lightly again the wound, and to her astonishment the wolf dog relaxed every muscle and let his head fall to the ground. Also, the growl died into a soft whine, and in turn ended. She had conquered. Aye, when the wound was thoroughly cleansed, and when she started to wind the bandage again, she even had the courage to touch Black Bart's body and make him rise so that she could pass the cloth freely. At her touch he shuddered, to be sure, as a man might shudder at the touch of an unclean thing. But there was no snarl, and the teeth were not bared. As she tied the knot which secured the bandage in its place, she was aware that the eyes of Bart, no longer yellow-green, watched her, and she felt some vague movement of the wonder what was passing through the brute mind. Then the head of the wolf dog jerked up. He was staring at something in the distance, and there was nothing under heaven that Bart would raise his head to look at in this manner except for one thing. The fingers of Kate grew stiff and trembled. Slowly, in a panic, she finished the knot, and then she was aware of someone who had approached without sound and now stood behind her. She looked up at length before she rose to her feet. Thankfulness welled up warm in her heart to find her voice steady and commonplace when she said, "The wound is much better. Bart will be well in a few days now." Whistlin Dan did not answer, and his wondering eyes glanced past her own. She saw that he was staring at a double row of white indentations on her forearm, where the teeth of Black Bart had set. He knew those marks, and she knew that he knew it. Strength was leaving her, and weakness went through her. Water where blood should have been. She dared not stay. In another moment she would be hopelessly in the grip of hysteria. So she rose, and she passed Dan without a word, and went slowly towards the house. She tried to hurry, indeed, but her legs would not quicken their pace. Yet at length she had reached shelter, and no sooner was she past the door of the house than her knees buckled. She had to steady herself with both hands as she dragged herself up the stairs to her room. And there, from the window, she looked down, and she saw Whistlin Dan standing as she had left him, staring blankly at the wolf dog. Well, friends, that's interesting. The dog's getting better above all. Good to hear that. And I'm glad y'all were here. It was good to see each and every one of you. I'm getting used to your faces. So let's do this again. You know when, you certainly know where. Well, until then, this is Clay Steele. Good night.